I'm Kelsey. This is my booktube channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing my fancy booktube hat, and today I'm bringing you my reading wrap-up for the month of June. And I noticed that I have a lot of books with blue covers. I don't know how that happened. In the first portion of this month, I participated in Tome Topple, which was a readathon. I already posted a separate wrap-up for the books that I read during Tome Topple, but I want to run through what those were. First up, I read Bitterblue by Kristin Cashore. This is the third and final book of the Graceling Realm Companion series. I still owe you guys a series review of these that will be coming hopefully very soon, towards the beginning of this month, and then I'll be able to return this to the library. I also read for the graphic novel challenge The Last Dragon by Jane Yolen with art by Rebecca Guay. But the thing I was primarily reading for the readathon was a bind-up edition of Patricia A. McKillip's Riddle-Master trilogy, which consists of the Riddle-Master of Head, Heir of Sea and Fire, and Harpist in the Wind. I wasn't going to talk about any of these books again in this wrap-up. I was just going to direct you to my last wrap-up for Tome Topple. But I did realize that in that video, while I did go into some detail about each of the individual books in the trilogy, I failed to give a proper explanation for what the trilogy as a whole is about. I think having just finished it, I would have been hard-pressed to do so, but I've had a little more time to think about it. This is an epic fantasy series from the 70s about a land where each of the individual kingdoms are governed by what's known as land law, and it's the ruler's magical connection to their own land, and the land law is sort of all under the overarching rule of someone or something known as the High One. The story concerns a prince of Head with a mysterious destiny and a princess of On with a mysterious heritage, some shapeshifters who show up and start stirring up trouble, and the mysterious history and also destiny of the realm. I hope that's a decent description because I think this trilogy can be a little difficult to describe. Anywho, now on to the books that I read this month, not for Tome Topple. The first book that I have here is All the Birds in the Sky by Charlie Jane Anders. I had started reading this before Tome Topple started, but I only got about halfway through, and then I had to put it aside for that readathon, and I finished it as soon as I finished all of my Tome Topple books. This book is a weird mashup of fantasy and near-future sci-fi, but that's not even what's really weird about it. What's really weird about it is the style of the writing, which is quirky and offbeat. And when I say that this was a weird book, I mean it in like an oh my gosh, woohoo, this is so weird way, like I really enjoyed it, not like an oh, this is weird. I enjoyed this book, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This is about Lawrence and Patricia. Patricia is a witch. Lawrence is a technological genius. They meet and become friends in the beginning of the book when they're both outcasts in school as kids. And then they meet again as adults in San Francisco as the world is barreling towards destruction from climate change and man-made catastrophes and so forth. So this is kind of about nature and science and our relationship as a species to our planet. Stylistically, I think I described this in my Goodreads review of it as kind of what I imagine might happen if Wes Anderson were hired to direct an SFF impending doom of the world blockbuster film. And I am not sure that is quite the right description. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is not quite the right description, but it's kind of in the ballpark. And I picked this up because, first of all, I really like things that mess with the boundary between sci-fi and fantasy in interesting ways. And second of all, because I really like things that are stylistically outside the box. And there are a lot of bits in this book that I just found really unexpected. I guess I like things that are stylistically unexpected. That is a draw for me, and so I really enjoyed reading this. I found a lot of bits, especially around the middle of this book, where something in the writing was just so surprising that I found it very funny. I laughed a lot, and towards the end it gets more serious, but it's still unusual and surprising. So if that's something that you like in a book, you might really like this book. I think if that's something that isn't a draw for you, you might be confused or perplexed or put off by this book. So I really enjoyed this book, and I gave it 4 stars. The next thing I read in the month was something I actually listened to on audiobook, and that is Night of Cake and Puppets, which is the novella that is part of Laini Taylor's Daughter of Smoke and Bone series. I had already read all 3 of the main trilogy, and I wanted to listen to this on audio because it's only available on audio and ebook, and I don't have an e-reader, so those were my options. And I really did want to give this a go before filming my full series review of the series. You can now check out my full series review of the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy. I will link that for you. I think I actually liked this novella better than any of the individual books of the series taken individually. I gave the novella 5 stars. It was wonderful. The next thing I read this month is being represented symbolically by this little piece of paper on which I've made notes, because it was an interlibrary loan and it has already had to go back. And that is Snow White Blood Red, which is an anthology of adult fairy tale retellings edited by Datlow and Terri Windling. It's the first of an anthology series that was published from, I think, the 80s through the 90s, the point of which sort of seems to be to prove that fairy tales are grown-up things and not just for kids. So what I've got here is literally just a list of all the stories in the anthology and who wrote them. I'm only really going to talk about some of them. Overall, there were like 3 stories I really, really loved. A few that I found interesting, even though they maybe didn't move me emotionally in great ways. But the vast majority of them were really just sort of meh for me. So the first 2 stories were actually 2 of my favorites in the collection, so it started out super strong for me. The first was Like a Red, Red Rose by Susan Wade. This may have been the only one in the whole collection that wasn't an actual retelling of a pre-existing story. It was more like an original fairy tale that happened to have some familiar elements in it. It had sort of that classic fairy tale feel. It's about a witch's daughter, and it was just a great way to open the collection. The second story was probably my favorite in the collection, and that is The Moon is Drowning While I Sleep by Charles DeLint. This was a retelling of a story I'd never heard of before called The Drowning Moon, and it does belong to DeLint's Newford world. I have been, you may know, wanting to start reading DeLint's books forever. I've acquired several of them, but this is actually the first thing of his I've actually managed to read. I happened to stumble upon this story in a collection I was already planning on reading, and I thought it was absolutely stunningly gorgeous. Basically, it's about a young woman who is kind of lucid dreaming every night the next portion of this story, in which she is in this other world where the moon is a woman who is trapped underwater drowning, and she has to rescue her. And the woman who is the moon who is drowning in this other dream world is either literally or symbolically, you kind of get to take your pick, her absent mother. And I thought it was just wonderful, and it made me feel things, and it made me really, really excited to read more from Charles DeLint. And then the collection continued. We have The Frog Prince by Graham Wilson, which is sort of like psychoanalysis of fairy tales thing, very short, I felt very meh about it. Stalking Beans by Nancy Kress is a Jack and the Beanstalk retelling. I felt very meh about it. Snowdrop by Tanith Lee is Snow White, and I also felt very meh about that. Little Red by Wendy Wheeler, and I Shall Do Thee Mischief in the Wood by, I do not know how to pronounce this name, Kathe Koja. Those are both Little Red Riding Hood retellings back to back. Felt very meh about both of them, despite the title. I don't think I Shall Do Thee Mischief in the Wood had anything to do with A Midsummer Night's Dream. That is a quote from that play. Next, we had 2 more that were the same story back to back. The Root of the Matter by Gregory Frost and The Princess in the Tower by Elizabeth A. Lynn were both Rapunzel retellings. These were stronger for me than the Little Red Riding Hood retellings. what was particularly interesting about them was how different they were from each other. The Princess in the Tower is more lighthearted than most of the stories in this collection, and it made me really want to eat Italian food. Next, there was Persimmon by Harvey Jacobs, which I felt really meh about. Then Little Pusset by Steve Raznik-Tem. I don't know if I'm pronouncing any of that correctly, but that was like meh to yuck for me. The Changelings by Melanie Tem started out super interesting. I was really interested to see how that story unfolded, and then I ended up being underwhelmed and disappointed by it in the end. Springfield Swans by Caroline Stevermer and Ryan Edmonds, meh. Trollbridge by Neil Gaiman. This one was interesting. This is one of the ones that I thought was interesting, even if I didn't wholeheartedly love it. It's a retelling of the Three Billy Goats gruff, and instead of like 3 goats crossing the bridge, it's one guy who finds the bridge as a kid and then comes back 2 more times in his life as he gets older. So I got kind of Ocean at the End of the Lane vibes from that. But while I respect Neil Gaiman as a writer a lot, I haven't read anything of his yet that I've really loved. Trollbridge was definitely one of the more interesting stories in this collection for me, though. Sound Like Angels Singing by Leonard Reisdyke, maybe how you pronounce it. Meh. Puss by Esther M. Friesner. That one was a retelling of Puss in Boots that I thought was really, really interesting. I thought it was a really cool, inventive take on the fairy tale. It wasn't one of my very, very favorites, but I definitely enjoyed seeing what she did with the story. The Glass Casket by Jack Dan, I thought that was pretty solid. Knives by Jane Yolen is actually a poem. It's a short poem, and it's about Cinderella. I liked it. You may remember, if you saw my Tome Topple wrap-up, that The Last Dragon was the first thing I'd read by Jane Yolen, and I felt like it just wasn't substantial enough to judge whether or not I like her as an author or not based on that, and I also feel like this poem was just not substantial enough to make any calls on whether or not I like her writing. But I did think it was a cool poem. And then The Snow Queen by Patricia A. McKillip. You know I like McKillip. This was maybe the longest story in the collection, definitely one of the longest stories in the collection, and it is a retelling of The Snow Queen, but I thought it was just a really, really lovely retelling. And that one was, I'm calling that one of my top 3 of the anthology. And then the last story in the collection was Breadcrumbs and Stones by Lisa Goldstein. I thought that was another one that I would put into the very interesting category, and I appreciated it. It wasn't one of my favorites, but I thought it was a really good bookend ending to the collection and a good kind of contrast to how Like a Red, Red Rose was a beginning to the collection. So I sort of feel when reading an anthology like that, it's gonna be a mixed bag, because there's such a variety within it that not every story is gonna appeal to the same people. I gave the book as a whole 3 stars on Goodreads. I feel like for me, if I find just even a couple of stories in an anthology that really grab me and that make me want to read more by that author, or make me glad to have found something that I didn't know about previously by an author I already like, then that makes the whole collection really worthwhile for me. So I'm going to see if I can find some of the other books in this anthology series to see what's in the rest of them. Eventually, not like right away, but eventually. I've got a lot of other books to read first. And the last book that I read this month was The Crane Wife by Patrick Ness. This was a book I already owned a copy of, and it was on my TBR, and I decided to throw it into this month's Reading Lineup because it's a current read for a Goodreads group called Into the Forest that reads a lot of fairy tale, folklore, and myth retellings. that I recently joined the group and I wanted to kind of jump in with a discussion on a book. I had not done that before with this group, and I thought that since I already owned this would be a good thing to pick up. And just a disclaimer, I have never read any of Patrick Ness's YA books before, so I don't have that comparison in my mind going into this. This is an adult magical realism book. It's a retelling of a Japanese folk tale, but this is a contemporary story set in England. It follows a middle-aged guy named George who is divorced and his young professional daughter named Amanda. And I thought this was interesting. I keep saying that a lot, interesting. I really liked the style of this book. It flowed really nicely. It was a pretty quick read. I loved the sort of take on the retelling, and it kind of played with the boundary between normal life and something that's more magical in ways that I thought were really lovely. I ended up not really liking the characters, however. It started out feeling like some of the characters were really kind of terrible stereotypes. They all got more dimensional as the story went on, but I still felt like everything about the characters and their personal journeys were all sort of only there to support the symbolism that was going on in this book, more than vice versa. So I gave this 3 stars. I'm really glad I read it, but it didn't blow me away. So that is everything that I finished reading in the month of June. You may remember in my TBR for the month, I said that if I got through all of that, I might start on Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, which is another book with a blue cover. But I ended up getting my hold in from the library on the Lie Tree, so I started this instead when I finished The Crane Wife. I'm a little over halfway through this. I'm hoping to finish this very soon. I'm really liking this book. And then I'll be bumping Left Hand of Darkness to July for my TBR, which will be the next video you see from me. Okay. If you have read any of the books in this video and want to talk to me about them, please leave a comment. That is all for my June wrap-up. Nice chatting with you. Bye for now.